Good morning, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the third thematic workshop of the ENSMOV project, focusing on addressing some of the challenges related to technical aspects of monitoring, reporting, and verification. I'm Jack Wilkinson, Policy Officer at the Energy Savings Trust, and we'll be quickly running you through the introductions and the ground rules. So, just a quick intro because our coordinator Vlasi will be introducing ENSMOV in greater detail. So just a quick summary from me. So ENSMOV, which stands for Enhancing the Implementation, Monitoring and Verification Practices of Energy Saving Policies under Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive, is a 3-year EU Horizon 2020 programme, now in its second year. The project is led by the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy, and it builds on lessons learned from its predecessors, ENSPOL and MULTI, with a broader focus this time around on both obligation schemes as well as alternative measures, and is designed to support public authorities and key stakeholders in 13 member states represented here, with all 27 member states, the UK and accession countries, to monitor, revise, improve and complement the design and implementation of their national energy efficiency policies. An often repeated set of challenges that has arisen from the need for adequate monitoring, reporting and verification of obligation schemes and alternative measures, which is an important requirement under Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive. MRV is essentially understanding both policy impacts and the continual improvement of obligation schemes. The difficulty often faced by member states on MRV in the context of Article 7 is how to deal with the sometimes complex requirements without this becoming a burden on time and finances. Results from an earlier ENSMOV stakeholder needs assessment indicate that the technical and practical aspects of MRV is an area in which policymakers think that they would benefit from knowledge exchange. The technical aspects refer to the specifics of how energy savings are measured, how they are recorded and communicated, and how their compliance is verified. To support member states with these challenges, this workshop will focus on 2 approaches to monitoring energy savings. We'll first have more of an in-depth introduction from our coordinator Vlasi, representing IEECP. We'll then consider the most common MRV method currently used across member states, which relies upon standard measures of energy savings, deemed measures. To discuss this, Patrick has kindly joined us from Ofgem, and he'll be taking us through the GB experience of delivering ECO, our energy obligation scheme. Gregor will then explore this area further, giving us the Austrian perspective. And in the second half of the workshop, we'll consider what could be possible with smart meters, pay performance methods, and direct measures of energy savings, measured or metered savings. And to discuss this, Alex has kindly joined us from Energy Pro. Alex has worked in this area for many years and is considered an expert on measured savings approaches. We'll also hear from Dario, who will be discussing the experience of metered savings in the Italian white certificate scheme. As part of this discussion, some of the issues we're hoping to explore include what the benefits and constraints of this approach can be, issues around generating effective baseline measurements, and how we can account for differences in climate, occupancy, and usage. Ultimately, we hope that this workshop will increase your understanding of how these technical issues have been dealt with in other member states and how the lessons learned can be applied in your own country context. For measured savings in particular, we know that several of those attending today have been considering this approach for future programmes, and this event also represents an excellent opportunity to start a conversation with experts in this area from across Europe and start that knowledge sharing process. So just quickly to housekeeping, I'll guess that this won't be the first virtual webinar that you will have attended, so lots of this should be second nature. The format of today's workshop will be a straightforward series of presentations with specific questions at the end of each of the two sections. We encourage you to ask questions at any point in the Q&A tab, and these will then be read out by my colleague Adriana, who will also be rounding up each section and introducing each of the new speakers. We all know by now that these online events aren't always a perfect imitation of the real thing, but we hope that you will find the process engaging, and we'll have lots to contribute and comment. These are extremely important areas of energy efficiency policy in each of our countries, and so we hope that you'll find something useful for your own country context here. I think that's probably enough for me, and so I'll now hand over to my colleague Adriana.
Thanks, Jack. Very warm welcome from me as well. I'm Adriana Threpsiadi from the Energy Saving Trust, and I'll be co-chairing this session today with Jack. I'm very much looking forward to all of the presentations and to all of your questions and comments as well, so please share them with us throughout. And before we get started with our first speaker of the day, I will hand the floor to Vlasis Economou, who is the ENSMOV project coordinator from IECP. So, Vlasis, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Elena. Okay. Great. Okay. Thanks a lot. As mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the ENSMOV project, and the title was well addressed before by Jack, so I think most of the issues are covered. But it's enhancing, just keep the two words, the implementation and MRV practices. So we speak about two angles of the implementation of the Article 7 of the EED. It's not only about MRV, but it's also about the implementation of the new policies. Indeed, we're in the second year, and these are the key objectives, and I'll just go briefly through that so you understand why we're doing all these things here. So the first one is to facilitate and expand the knowledge sharing and experience among member states for the implementation of policies. So we do have the current status of the policies running up to 2020, and then we have the new period 2021-2030 for the implementation of the Article 7 EED. And then we have a lot of new policies coming up from most member states. We speak about policies that will be criticized or policies that have already gained a lot of experience and can provide a lot of savings. And therefore, I mean, that's where ENSMOV will help in building up these policies into robust schemes. Then the second one is to develop a suite of tailored resources and tools for the implementation of the Article 7 for the needs of member states. Indeed, here it's not only about discussing among member states, but also generating a series of tools, reports, very customized thematic reports, as for instance on state aid rules or on other aspects that can be helpful for member states when you try to implement currently the EED, but also the Article 7 of the EED, but also when you need to report things back to the Commission in the coming years. And then to assist national authorities, the in-house MRV schemes, and to redesign the policy. So that's one of the points where now this workshop will be based on. Indeed, that's what the partners are mainly from national energy agencies, but also some universities and some research centers. And indeed, as it was mentioned before, this project is built on the ENSPOL, which I was coordinating also in the past, and the multi projects, two Horizon, the one Intelligent Energy Europe, this is a Horizon 2020 project. So the one was about the EED, the Article 7 EED in general, and the multi was about MRV schemes and how member states can build upon them. And these are the challenges from a first needs assessment we carried out. I hope you can see that very briefly. From most member states, the key issues is to ensure sustainability of policies that you implement on the Article 7. The other challenge is to get political support or to create complementarity with other policies. That's also one of the issues very much criticized, that there is a lot of double counting, so there is a lot of overlaps between policies, and budget commitments for the policy implementation. And then on the MRV aspects, some key elements we found from most member states: there's difficulty with data and verification requirements, so how to set the baselines, of course the lack of staff, and the complexity of the MRV requirements and administrative burdens. And keep in mind, with the new 2021-2030 period, also MRV requirements are quite strict, and most member states and all member states need to adhere to them. Then that's about the learning exchange. We have a lot of different workshops and national meetings and webinars, just to keep in mind that we don't speak only about these EU level events, but we also have a lot of national events taking place. Of course, due to the COVID restrictions, everything is online, but we have a lot of topics being covered annually. And here is where I would like to ask our audience, if you have specific questions or specific issues that you face in your member states in implementing the Article 7, just propose them to us, and we're happy to, and we have the flexibility and time, of course, to come up with the thematic workshops or very tailored and focused workshops to deal with these aspects. So, for instance, we have been having some workshops on so far on the cost effectiveness of the alternative measures, mainly of the subsidy schemes and the financial schemes. And now we're going to have another event on the taxation, on the role of the taxation of the Article 7 EED, further events on the financing of the energy efficiency obligation schemes, etc. So there is a lot of different diverse topics that we try to capture within our workshops. If you have ideas, feel free to share them with us, and we are happy to assist you. Soon, the update of the platform, the Article 7ED.eu, this was generated by the ENSPOL project, and will be updated, and you will be able to have all the different types of information you need about the Article 7. This will be maintained for, I hope, for more than 5 or 6 years, after the end of the project, and it's easy for member states to get a lot of knowledge materials from there. And if you want to contact us, that's our contact. Please browse a bit our reports and what we are generating on the ENSMOV EU. Feel free to discuss about the Article 7 and subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks a lot and good luck with the workshop.
Great, thank you very much, Vlasis. So our first speaker of the day is Patrick Etheridge from Ofgem, which is the UK's energy regulator, and he'll be discussing MRV under the Energy Company Obligation and how they've dealt with common issues in the UK. And just as a reminder to everyone, please type your questions, comments, or anything else in the questions box that's in the right-hand side panel there. And in line with the Chatham House rule, no comments or questions will be directly attributed to any of you, so please ask your questions freely. I will now hand over to Patrick.
Great, thanks, Adriana.
Okay.
This works.
Yep.
Right, is that correct?
Yep, that's perfect. Great, yeah. Thanks, Patrick.
Great. Thank you very much. So yeah, I'm Patrick Etheridge from the UK. I work for Ofgem, which is the energy regulator for the UK. So here to talk about the ECO scheme. So I'll do a quick introduction to tell you what the ECO scheme is, then how we score measures, the kind of standards that measures have to be installed towards, some of the operational and compliance processes that we have in place. But I'm going to spend most of my time talking about two particular processes, one called monitoring and one called duplicates. So the quick introduction. So yeah, as I said, the Energy Company Obligation, or we call it ECO, was first introduced in 2013. It's an energy efficiency scheme for Britain. So that's England, Scotland and Wales. It places a legal obligation on larger energy suppliers to deliver energy efficiency measures to households. So I talk about this term measures. I noticed that in the last webinar, measures can mean a different thing for different member states. So here we're talking about an individual installation to a household. So for example, cavity wall installation installed to one particular house, that would be classed as one measure. And I put a link in there, so I'll share these slides afterwards in case anyone's interested, but it is a link to the screenshot I put into the slide as well. So that's the top of our table, our measures table, which shows all the different kind of measure types that are eligible under ECO. So it's just the top section. So you'll see things like external and internal wall insulation, cavity wall insulation, and so on. But there's also some heating measures in there as well. So it's an obligation on larger energy suppliers, so suppliers who tend to have more than 150,000 domestic customers. We currently have about 24 obligated suppliers under the scheme, and their obligations are determined based upon their share of the domestic energy market. Okay, so as I said, we focus on insulation and heating measures, and the focus is towards vulnerable consumer groups. So it's an energy efficiency scheme, but it's also a social scheme at the same time. So it aims to target fuel poverty and to alleviate that. Suppliers work with third parties, so installers, to deliver measures. So you'll see from the infographic to the right that we set the obligation, that's Ofgem. Suppliers work with installers to deliver measures. Installers approach homeowners and complete work in their households. Installers then notify the measures back to suppliers. Suppliers notify them to us. And it's at that point when suppliers notify them to us that we perform our compliance checks. So as I said, eligibility is primarily determined by social benefits. So it is more of a fuel poverty scheme, but there is an energy efficiency component to it as well. So properties that have a low energy rating are also eligible under the scheme. And then we also offer local authorities, so local councils, for example, the opportunity to choose households for themselves that they think should benefit from the scheme. So there's a few different ways in which measures can be installed. So far, we've had approximately 2.3 million households benefited from ECO. So that's since the start of 2013. Okay, yeah, so scoring measures, we use lifetime bill savings. So what we mean by that is that the savings that a homeowner is expected to receive over the lifetime of the measure installed to their property. So that's the score the measure is given. So we Yes, and that's over the lifetime of the measure, sorry. So when a measure is installed, we give it a particular lifetime. We say it's expected to last this long. The annual saving is this, and then we multiply those two things together. That gives the score of the measure. And we work with industry experts to produce a series of deemed scores for different measure types. So I've included another screenshot at the bottom of this slide, which shows just a few different measures, and then the annual savings and then the lifetime. So these are different examples of internal wall insulation. But the score will vary according to the characteristics of the property. So whilst you'll have a basic score for internal wall insulation, that will vary according to things like the number of bedrooms, the construction type of the property, the heating system in place, and things like the percentage of property that's been treated. So if they haven't treated the whole property, then obviously that will reduce the score for that particular measure. And we are, so this is the system we currently use. We are also starting to test some more in situ monitoring technologies. So that's where we record the live performance of the measure. So I understand that this will be talked about in a bit more detail from potentially other member states later on in the webinar, but this is under ECO. This is something we're just starting to experiment with. It's very early to tell how effective it is. We've not actually had that much of it under ECO so far. It's a very recent introduction. But one thing we do know at this point is that the cost of this kind of technology is definitely a limiting factor. So until that can be reduced, we probably won't see much use of that under ECO at least. Okay, so the standards measures must be installed towards. So we have this thing called the publicly available specification, which we abbreviate to say PAS. And there's generic building standards that measures must be installed to as well. So PAS 2019 is the most recent version of this standards, and this has introduced something quite different. So it's a whole house approach. So instead of installing single measures in isolation, which is what I think was being done quite a lot beforehand, there's more of a focus here on making sure that the entire house is treated, or at least an entire design is put together to make sure that measures that work well together are put in the same property, but also to prevent issues from, so for example, installing a heating system into a household that's not well insulated. There's kind of very little point in doing that if the heat's then going to escape. So it's making sure that the whole house is considered when putting the design of these measures together. So this has made things slightly more complicated, but it's certainly moving in the right direction, we think. So we're currently in the transition phase from the previous version of these standards, the PAS 2017, and moving towards the PAS 2019. So it's quite a complicated time for ECO, because we've got people working to different standards whilst both are actually still relevant. So operational and compliance processes. So we conduct, as I said before, we conduct various checks on measures once they're notified from suppliers to us to make sure they're compliant. So this includes, but isn't limited to, checks on things like the data format. So it's fairly simple stuff there, but then address checks. So ECO is only for domestic properties, so it's not for industry or anything commercial. So we make sure the addresses that are notified to us are domestic properties. It's quite an important one. And then the two that I want to focus on are duplicates and technical and score monitoring. So I'll cover those in more detail in the next few slides. But just to say, we also have a dedicated counter-fraud team that we work very closely with. We do perform a series of audits as well. So a lot of those are kind of fairly standard and basic audits that we do regularly. But then we might also do some more ad hoc audits based upon intelligence that we receive from industry or from results that we see in our own data. So monitoring. So we split monitoring into two areas. So there's technical monitoring and score monitoring. Technical focuses on the standards of installation, and then score monitoring makes sure that measures are scored accurately. For each of those different types of monitoring, we've got a different question set, and so we have input from industry in putting that question set together. So we have a working group that we meet fairly regularly with, and we discuss with them the different questions that we have and whether any need to be updated according to changes to standards or learnings that we've had from our experience so far. So suppliers must be independent. Suppliers must use independent and suitably qualified monitoring agents. So the way this process works is suppliers have their delivery, and then we ask them to commission inspections on their delivery, and they must use so operatives or monitoring agents who are independent of them to make sure that their checks and their inspections are impartial. So a bit more about the structure of technical and score monitoring. So this applies to both. So for each of TM and SM, as we call them, and for each supplier in each quarter of the year, we require that a minimum of 5% of every measure type is monitored, and also that a minimum of 3% of every installer's delivery that a supplier has worked with is monitored. So I'll try and explain that another way to make it absolutely clear. So for example, in January to March this year, that's one quarter. So for that particular quarter, every supplier had to monitor at least 5% of every measure type that was installed in that quarter by them. But they also had to make sure that every installer they worked with in that particular quarter, at least 3% of each installer's delivery was also monitored. So it gives us a really clear and representative picture of the different measure types that were installed and the installers that they worked with. And so these results are reported to us for us to analyze. And I put that Venn diagram in the bottom right. So that shows that whilst we've got these different requirements, actually suppliers can choose measures that can tick all three of those boxes. So they can find measures that would fulfill the installer delivery, the measure type, and the TM and SM requirement. So, and that's fine. Suppliers are allowed to do that. It's an efficient way to do it, and it cuts cost, which is important because this scheme is funded through the energy suppliers, so they pass on the cost to consumers through their energy bills. And that's across their entire supply. So it's important that they do deliver eco as efficiently as possible to reduce those costs on the bill payer. Okay, so once we have those results, we look at trends for both the measure type and the installer. It's difficult to take action on measure types if we see poor performance for a particular measure type. We don't want to really take too much action there. It's more informative for further research, for reporting to other organizations and so on, to see if we need to do more of a wider kind of investigation. But we don't want to take too much action because it could be that it's just a few installers who are causing the concern, in which case if we took action on the entire measure type, we might affect installers who are actually performing really well. So the focus is primarily on the performance of installers, and in order to do that we have this thing called a pathway to compliance. So when we've got those results back from suppliers, those monitoring results, we look at the failure rates or the pass rates, whichever way you want to look at it, and where the pass rate isn't high enough, so where the failure rate is above a certain threshold, what we do is we put the measures for that particular installer within that quarter at risk. And what that means is that we don't approve those measures until we've received assurance from the installer about what they're going to do to correct the situation. And this often means that suppliers will often have contracts in place with their installers which have clauses in them to say that if the measures are put at risk, then the supplier will withhold funding from the installer. So there's a clear incentive there for the installer to make sure that they correct these issues in order to be able to be paid by the supplier. So that's not something that we require. That's just the way the supplier installer relationship works, but it kind of tends to work for our advantage. So any measures with a failed inspection must be corrected. So that's specific measures. And then if that, as I said, if the failure rate is above a certain threshold, then we're going to require further monitoring, so more inspections to be conducted on the measures within the same sample. The installer must also contact us directly to confirm that they've investigated and found out what the cause of the failure was, and that they've ensured all of their other measures don't have the same problem, and also that they have an action plan in place to ensure that this kind of thing won't happen in the future. Once we've received all of that and we're satisfied, then we'll release the measures from that risk, which means the installer is likely to get paid by the supplier. So the challenges with this, so we have this phenomenon called Phoenix companies, which you might not have come across before. So we see a number of installers who deliberately install measures quickly and perhaps to poor standards. They get paid for their work and then they disappear from the market, and then often will reappear under a different name somewhere else. It's quite hard to track. So that's one really big issue that we face. And the only way really to get around this is to work with our counter fraud team. We identify individuals at these companies rather than just their company names, the actual individual people who are moving from one company to another, and we try and track them and report them to the relevant authorities. But this is something that is a constant source of concern. Also, inability to access a property. So particularly with COVID, we can't avoid talking about it, I'm afraid, but that has made it much more difficult to access properties for many reasons. There was always a difficulty to begin with anyway, because after someone's had a measure installed at their property, they often don't want to see any more people arriving at their property to perform more inspections. So sometimes they just refuse access. So we do have some tolerance there, but COVID has certainly made this much more of a problem. So we found ways around that. So we now employ remote inspections. So we allow suppliers to use paperwork and perform a desk-based inspection instead in some cases. And so they use things like photographs instead. It's definitely not as accurate, but it's the only real solution we have at this stage, given the climate we're kind of currently working in. We also receive criticism from industry along the way. So because we do replicate some of the checks that other bodies within industry already complete. So in order to be able to operate under ECO, installers need to have received a certain certification. And so those bodies that issue that certification will often do some checks of their own. We do tend to replicate those in some instances, but as long as we see failure rates in those areas, as long as we see concerns, then we think it justifies us doing those checks as well. But we do receive some criticism for that, so we have to work with industry as best we can to make sure that we're all happy and on the same page. The other concern is that actually across all of the eco schemes, so eco 1, 2 and 3, failure rates don't appear to be dropping. So this in some ways can be interpreted to mean that the monitoring process isn't working, but in other ways actually it demonstrates that where we are identifying failure rates, it is working. So whilst it's not dropping, the more we do identify failure rates, it shows that we are actually highlighting these, and it kind of justifies the process, because if we didn't have this process in place, then these failure rates, these deficiencies in installation would not be identified. So that's monitoring. Onto duplicates. So we need to ensure that the lifetime bill savings, so the scores of measures, haven't already been notified to us by the same or another supplier. So for the same measure installed at the same address. So we perform monthly checks when we receive new measures every month. We check them against the current Eco 3 scheme to see if they've already been notified. And we also check them against previous iterations of Eco, so Eco 1 and 2, so going back to 2013. We look for exact matches, so where 2 boilers, for example, are installed at the same property. But we also look for incompatible combinations, so where a boiler and an electric storage heater are installed at the same property, because that's a fairly unlikely scenario, so something that's worthy of investigation. We see 3 main types of duplicate. Administrative error is one, so that's a genuine mistake, so where the same measure has been notified twice by accident, which does happen. They're fairly easy to resolve. We see instances of fraud. So again, that's a fairly easy one to resolve, because where we find frauds, we reject the measure from the scheme, and there's no room for discretion there. And then we also see a number of genuine measures, so where both parties, so where both suppliers who've notified the same measure argue that they have installed a measure, it is a genuine measure. So that's a bit more complicated. In every case, we notify the relevant suppliers first and ask them to investigate first before they come back to us. But a bit more detail about the types of duplicates. So where it's within Eco 3, within the current scheme, it's fairly easy to resolve, because, as I said before, with administrative error and a fraud situation, we can just reject the measure that isn't valid, or both if neither of them are valid. But where we look at duplicates across schemes, so if we found a boiler that was already installed under Eco 2 and there's one been installed under Eco 3 as well, it gets a bit more complicated, because we can't actually do anything with the measure that was installed under Eco 2. So if the suppliers say that the Eco 2 measure was never installed, it was invalid, we've already counted those savings, we've already made a final determination on that particular scheme. So there's nothing we can really do in that situation. And that's to say that kind of goes with fraud as well. So if the earlier measure is found to be fraudulent, then normally we'd want to reject that. But because it's under a previous scheme, the savings have already been counted. So we're faced with a dilemma, because it means that we either choose to reject the current measure because the savings have already been counted under a previous scheme, but that means a genuine measure might be rejected from the scheme, and the installer that installed it is being penalized, perhaps unfairly. But if we accept the measure, if we accept both measures, then actually we are undermining the previous target from the previous scheme, because it's obvious that the achievements under the previous scheme weren't actually achieved after all, because some of those savings weren't realized. With genuine measures, it gets even more complicated. So ECO's existed for over 7 years now, so it is conceivable that some measures installed in the previous schemes might need replacing, even if they haven't reached their expected lifetime. So we do tend to, in most cases, accept situations where both are being claimed as valid and the evidence supports it. However, we receive thousands of these duplicates every month, so it's a significant number, and it's almost exclusively boilers. So this is where the real problem lies with boilers. And so we don't believe that all of these genuine measures are genuine, but it's very difficult to prove either way, because we find that with the evidence that we request, it kind of doesn't matter what evidence we request. It could be forged if someone was determined enough. So if someone really wanted to commit fraud and trick us, then it's quite easy for them to do so, because we can't really think of any realistic evidential requirements that would avoid this. So the question, as I said before, is do we accept these or do we not accept them? So currently we are investigating every single situation. So we're receiving thousands of these every month, and we have to look into every single one to look at the evidence that supports it and make an assessment based upon that. And as I said before, if we accept both measures, then it means that the score under a previous scheme wouldn't be realized, because actually we found out that the previous measure might not be valid. But then if we don't accept the current measure, then we're penalizing an installer unfairly who has perhaps installed something in all honesty. So potential solutions, I think this is my last slide. So potential solutions. So one way in which we can resolve this is to shorten the lifetimes of measures and adjust the savings accordingly. So that way, if a boiler was only given a 2-year lifetime, then it doesn't matter if it's replaced after 2 years, because the savings won't be double counted. Obviously, this is quite an inaccurate method, and it actually incentivizes early replacement, because as soon as the 2 years is up, then we would certainly see a spike in those boilers being replaced if they can be claimed again under the ECO scheme legitimately. So it's a thought, but it's not really a good solution. The best way we think to do this is to offer guarantees. So upon installation, a boiler is given a guarantee that covers it for its entire lifetime. So that means that if it broke down at any point within its lifetime, so say it was a 5-year lifetime, if it broke down at any point within that 5 years, then the installer would be obliged to reinstall it or to repair it for free, and there'd be no way to claim it under ECO. So this reduces the incentive for replacement of healthy boilers, and so reduces probable fraud. However, this kind of guarantee would make measures like this very expensive. So it might be that we actually make it too expensive for it to be worth installing under ECO. So the cost of installation may go up. Yeah, so there's some of the solutions we're looking into. As I said, there are a few challenges, but that's all I had to say on duplicates, and that's the end of my presentation as well. So thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, please do fire them my way in the comments box, or if you've got any that you think of later on, then those are 2 email addresses you can use to email us directly. So yeah, thanks again very much for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Patrick. That's really interesting. And yeah, thank you everyone for sending in your questions. So we will address those after our next speaker, who is Gregor Thenius from the Austrian Energy Agency, who are responsible for MRV in Austria, and he'll be discussing the technical aspects of their scheme. So I will hand over presenter rights to Gregor.
Okay, so hello from Vienna. I hope you can all see my screen. I will now start.
Gregor, do you mind putting it into the full screen mode so it's bigger for people to see? Perfect, thank you.
So now I'm trying to figure out how to minimize all that so I can also see the slides perfect. Okay, yes. Well, hello, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk a little bit about our challenges or experiences. I work with the National Energy Efficiency Monitoring Agency, Monitoringstelle Energieeffizienz, and we were founded or installed in the year 2014, when more or less the implementation of the EED in Austria started. And we are in charge of basically mainly supervising the energy efficiency obligation scheme, but then also to collect data from other measures in Austria, policy instruments in Austria, and preparing them for the reports to the European Union. I think it was already very nice in the presentation of Patrick just before to see that well, the challenges seem to be quite similar, and there always is a trade-off between being very accurate, very precise, knowing everything, controlling everything, and of course the administrative costs that cause this accuracy. And I think we're facing exactly similar challenges. Okay, so this introductory slide, it's not about the numbers, it's also not about the names of all these schemes, but I would just like to remind you that in Austria, we, for Article 7, we have a mix of alternative strategic measures and the energy efficiency obligation scheme. So in the first row, you see the energy efficiency obligation scheme. The numbers are savings that have been reported by Austria for the years until 2018, so implementation date. But you can see that there are quite a number of also very high saving producing energy efficiency instruments. I will now focus on the energy efficiency obligation scheme, but I will say some words on double counting also afterwards on the other schemes. My presentation now will tackle 3 issues. The first is the sample, representative sample, in the controls for the energy efficiency obligation scheme. The second is on double counting, and then I will also shortly and maybe make a nice, let's say, transition to the presenters after me to the question of the evaluation of energy savings and deemed savings approach in Austria. So I believe some of you might have already seen this picture, because I realized that in May, I think there was already a presentation from Austria that showed the general approach in MRV. So today I will focus more on the details. But I would just like to remind you that we very early, already actually before the EED, when we had voluntary agreements, we installed an online database, and all the reporting for the voluntary agreements, but then also for the EOs is through this online database. So we have quite a good, let's say, collection mechanism of data. And the second thing that might be important is that we don't have pre-checks. So individual actions are controlled always after being reported by an obligated party. We have a quite straightforward, I think, and most schemes, I assume, do that 3-step evaluation process. We check for plausibility over all data that we receive. We try in this plausibility check to be as automatic as possible. So one, let's say, issue here with this plausibility check is, for example, to identify double counting. We have in-depth checks, but these in-depth checks are desktop controls, so they are based on paper files only. And here we draw this representative sample to check a relevant number of individual actions. And here we look if there is no deemed savings method available for the calculation of energy savings and for the documentation of the measure. So did the measure even take place? And then we have a limited amount of on-site controls, and I will go to all these issues a little bit more in detail on the next slides. So on the sample, I think I don't want to be too philosophic or anything, but I mean, I think it's worthwhile mentioning that in a perfect world, and sometimes I think policymakers imagine this perfect world because they say there are laws and people will just comply with laws and rules. So in this perfect world, no control would be necessary because everybody acts according to the rules. I think in all schemes we see that this is not the case, and the reasons for that might not always be that there is an intention to not follow the rules. But so I think the second step would be the optimal state in an imperfect world where not everybody acts according to the rules would be to look at 100% of reported savings. Which is not possible, at least in Austria, because we have a very wide scheme. So the energy efficiency obligation scheme covers all sectors, all individual actions, industry, services, transport, households, heating, all kind of measure categories. Nothing is excluded as long as it's final energy. So the resources needed to check 100% of the measures would be incredibly high. We have, in some years, we have 10,000 reports of measure bundles or individual actions. So first of all, there are cost efficiency considerations. We just cannot do that because it would be too expensive. But then also, I think we should also ensure to be not, let's say, or to ensure a level playing field also with other policy instruments. So not to be stricter with the energy efficiency obligation scheme and then put actually the EEOs in a worse position compared to other policy instruments. And so we have to draw a sample. So as we cannot control all the measures, we have to draw a sample. And I think there are two issues or two main aspects of the sample. The first one is the size of the sample. And of course, it's easy to say, let's say we take 10% and 10% is a good number for a sample and it's representative regardless what the overall population of individual actions is. I personally, and I think we also saw that in our experiences, I don't think that the size of the sample plays such an important role. Of course, you would have problems if you said you check, let's say, 0.1% of the savings, something like that. And this leads me to the composition of the sample. And here I think this is much more important. You can ensure there the representativeness, but you can also, let's say, put emphasis on certain measures. And I will describe that in a minute. So again, our steps of defining the overall sample, and each of these steps also contributes to the sample. So 100% of reported individual actions are checked for plausibility. I would say for this, even to be able to do that, you need a centralized online reporting database, because there you can really ask for all the information that you need to do this automatic plausibility checks. It will not help you to have information in a PDF document or in other documents. You really need to make obligated parties to enter the data that you need for the plausibility checks. So again, the next balance here, of course, you need to find a balance between the data input for plausibility checks and reporting effort. It would be difficult probably to require from obligated parties to enter 100 pieces of information manually in this online database in order to be able to make the plausibility check. Maybe this is interesting in Austria, I don't know whether it's different elsewhere, but in the Energy Efficiency Act, so in the law, the size of the sample is not determined, but in the contract, of course, with the ministry, a number is foreseen. However, we are quite flexible in determining how this number can be interpreted. So what I mean with that is that usually this this number that is defined, we see them as the minimum requirement, let's say. So this percentage is XY% of reports are checked at least, but the amount of savings that is checked within this percentage is much higher. And in this, when we draw this sample, then we do desktop controls where we look really in detail at all the documents, question everything that the obligated party has reported. And then the on-site controls, they kind of complete the picture. Here, in the beginning, we were not sure how to deal with these on-site checks, but in the end, we had one main argument how to choose these measures that are checked on-site. And as is said here on the slide, the on-site controls are only done for individual actions that showed no problems, no flaws during the desktop controls. And with that, we want to, let's say, avoid a reward for poorly documented measures, because an obligated party could say, well, I don't have to document the measures because they will come anyway and check afterwards whether this all is accurate. So this is our approach at the moment for the on-site controls. On the composition of the sample, as I said before, we have these automatic processes that are done over all the whole population of measures. And here we have a kind of a scoring system where we determine the risk of flaws identified in this process. For example, if the percentage of savings is very high, then you get a certain, let's say, score on there might be problems with the percentage of savings. If the year of implementation is not plausible, or if the risk of double counting is very high. So from this group of measures, one part of this representative sample comes from the measures with the highest scores that are determined automatically. Then, however, computers do not find out everything, and we don't have a solution for that at the moment. We also do manual plausibility checks where we look, for example, at the measure titles, name of the action. So we really go manually through the list of reported measures. And that is mainly the description of the measure, the name of the measure that could be not very clear, or also actions where it could be debatable whether it's even an end-use energy measure. And then we have anyway categories of individual actions with a high risk of loss. For example, the end-use energy, as I said before, energy networks, for example. So if we say the word transformers somewhere, we get also suspicious. Or if there is a measure on waste heat, we have always discussions whether it depends a lot on the details of the project, whether this is eligible for Article 7 or for DEOs or not. Then materiality and additionality issues, for example, with just consumer goods like white goods and LEDs. Measures with complex methodological issues, public transport, for example, virtual servers, or high savings. And so these two steps, automatic plausibility checks and manual checks that are also, let's say, that are fed by our experience over the years, they form this representative sample. And then, of course, we also have a share of measures that are completely by chance. So we just use them using a chance mechanism. So for the automatic plausibility checks, as I said before, obligated parties have to enter some information, specific technical information on the measure. Like, for example, here I have appliances, the appliance type, the number of appliances, power of the appliance, operating hours. And from this, then energy savings are calculated. And besides general information on the measure, like, for example, the place of the measure or the end user that implemented the measure, we can identify the risk of problems with these measures. Okay, so that's the sample. We have an automatic plausibility check. We choose some measures completely by chance, and then we also make, let's say, we have clusters of measures that usually pose problems, and they just have a higher probability of being in the sample. On double counting, I will be a little bit shorter probably. I just would again like to highlight the importance of a centralized database. And so I'm not now turning to the general information that we collect with the database. And you see here the general data that has to be entered in any case is the name of the beneficiary. So where did the measure, in which end customer did the measure take place? The date of implementation, the address of the action, an active declaration whether a subsidy has been taken, an other subsidy has been taken or not, and the measure category. Of course, the energy savings, but this depends a lot whether it's a deemed savings measure or individually evaluated. And then also documentation has to be uploaded. There is some minimal amount of documentation that has to be uploaded. And you can say that mainly this information from step 1, so the general data, is used to identify possible double counting within the energy efficiency obligation scheme. So in this database, of course, we only collect data from the EEOs. So this is done automatically to a large extent, and then of course in the desktop, in detailed desktop controls, there is another step of again checking for double counting. But there is a second, for us, there is a second challenge with double counting, which is double counting between different schemes. So between, let's say, a public subsidy scheme and the energy efficiency obligation scheme. And I just show you and we chose here, I would say, a very pragmatic approach that maybe leads us to losing some energy savings, but at least we're on the safe side. And I would just shortly like to show you this example. So let's start at these measures that are called AM1 to AM5. And let's say we want to make a double counting analysis of heat pumps. So our basic motto is the winner takes it all, more or less, but of course it's not that easy. So the alternative measure 1 is a subsidy scheme in the commercial sector. The alternative measure 2 is a subsidy scheme in the transport sector. Alternative measure 3 is on public buildings. Alternative measure 4 is a provincial subsidy scheme for households, and alternative measure 5 is a federal subsidy scheme for households. So we start with the, let's say, with the most with the two policy instruments that are closest to each other, and these are AM4 and 5 because they both target the household sector. And here we take only the savings that come from the scheme with the higher savings. So we discard all the savings from AM5 and say, okay, in our report for Article 7, we only take AM4. And then, but that's not all, of course, because we can then also add the savings from the subsidy scheme in the commercial sector and for public buildings, because AM4 only targets households. So we add these and have here the, let's say, the corrected savings in this alternative measures. We have the corrected savings for all the alternative measures in Austria. And in the final step, we compare these overall savings with the overall savings from heat pumps in the energy efficiency obligation scheme. And here again, the winner takes it all. As you can see, the alternative measures have produced higher savings. So in this example, the heat pump savings, or let's say heat pump savings, would only be reported from alternative measures. Of course, this is not always the case. In many instances, the EEOs has higher savings and so gets all the savings. And in this specific case, we also have to discard all measures or savings from the EEOs, because as I said before, the EEOs targets everything. It targets the household sector, the commercial sector, industry, all the sectors, and it would be just too costly to check each individual project for double counting between different schemes. What this approach ensures is that no savings are reported more than once for Article 7. So again, as I said, we are on the safe side. And finally, very shortly, I think, just to the issue of evaluation of energy savings. This might again be a nice transition to the next presentations. So we are using, let's say, to a large extent, standardized calculation methods. Many of them are a deemed savings approach. And here, this picture just shows you the amount of methods that we developed. So we have, all in all, we have 42 methods at the moment, standardized calculation methods, which more or less means deemed savings methods, for around 250 individual energy saving actions. Because, for example, in the category, let's say heating, of course, you have all different kinds of, you have heat pumps, you have district heating, you have different kinds of measures. So a large extent of savings comes from standardized methods. However, the Austrian EEOs foresees basically two approaches, and this again is due to the fact that we are not only targeting the household sector, which is quite well fitted for deemed savings approach, but also the industry and commercial sector. So in principle, you can have this, you can use the standardized methods with a large share of deemed savings, or you can use individual calculations. There is a decree that lays down the rules on how to perform these individual calculations. And what we see is that they are mostly engineering estimates, so most of it is ex ante. But in principle, metered savings are also possible. The problem being just the time of implementation of the measure and the need to report the measures is, in Austria, is so short. It's only 2 months, because you have to report all the measures until the middle of February, that the metered approach is just not possible in many cases. Yes, and on the deemed savings, maybe also one remark that we are required by law to evaluate the standardized methods and the deemed savings values and propose changes if appropriate or necessary. However, the methods themselves then have to be adapted by decree by the ministry. So the minister herself would need to change the methods by decree, and this is really something I would say we cannot really recommend, because it's a relatively cumbersome process. It becomes very political, of course, if there is an official action from a minister involved in this process. And we didn't do too much on that, but this is also just a remark that the Article 7 energy savings and the development of energy consumption, so let's say the development of the Article 3 target and the Article 7 target, are in a way, of course, analyzed, and the reasons are looked for why certain developments take place, and we have to report these analysis to the Austrian Parliament. So this brings me to the end. Yeah, I hope that I could get you some more detailed insights into our approach, also maybe highlight some challenges. And yeah, I'm happy to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Gregor. So that brings us to the question and answer section. So if I can invite Patrick back to the screen as well. And yeah, we do have multiple questions. We'll try and answer as many as we can, but if we can't, and if the speakers are in agreement, perhaps we can circulate something in writing as a follow-up afterwards. So first up, we had a question for Patrick, which I think was more of a clarification. Are there also targeted controls done by Ofgem?
So yeah, I'm not quite sure what that means, but I guess so. We, as I said before, we tell the suppliers, the energy suppliers, the obligated parties to perform monitoring themselves. We don't do any specific monitoring ourselves. We don't send our own operatives out. We don't have anyone who's got an Ofgem badge on who's going out to our household to inspect an installation or anything like that. No, we don't have enough resources for that, unfortunately. Yeah, so it's the suppliers who do most of that work. However, as I said, we do have audits that we will carry out, but again, we don't actually go out ourselves. We would commission or work with a third-party auditor to do it on our behalf. So where we do see concerns for a particular measure type, for example, so in my presentation I talked about how we focus mostly on installers and not measure types, but if we did see huge concerns for a particular measure type, so in the past we've had concerns for underfloor insulations has been quite a big one. So in those cases, we may well commission an audit and get an external auditor to go out and do the work on our behalf. Yes, so we never do anything directly, but we'll do it via another party. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that clarifies it. And we also had several questions about failure rates. So one was, what is a typical failure rate of failed inspections? And there was another question of, could you give an example of what is considered a failure?
So
is it
yeah,
with installation? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So a failure rate, we have a baseline of 10%, which is actually quite high. I think it's quite a generous failure rate. So any situation where we see a failure rate that's below 10%, we kind of accept that as okay, as long as the inspections that failed are corrected. So those measures are fixed to make sure that they're working correctly again, so they would pass an inspection. But anything that goes above a 10% failure rate for a particular subset of measures. So if an installer had higher than 10%, then that's when a pathway to compliance is triggered, and that's where we ask for additional information, so additional assurances to make sure that that particular wider subset of measures isn't also suffering from the same problems that that we've already identified. And then the higher the failure rate, the more severe the consequences. So if it's just over 10%, then we'll be kind of fairly relaxed when we review the information. But if it's anything above 30%, then we do tend to require a bit more detail. And then the other question was about what kind of failures we see, I think, is that right? So
Yeah.
I talked about the standards that we work to. So most of the questions are geared towards those standards. So it asks specific questions. So with insulation, for example, we're looking to make sure that there are no gaps that might lead to thermal bridging. That's quite a big one. Or that there's appropriate ventilation in place to make sure that, again, if there are any gaps in insulation that are there necessarily, that moisture can't build up and you don't get condensation and you don't get things like mold, so things like that. So it's questions that look at is the measure going to deliver the savings it should be, and is it going to cause any problems for the household? If the answer to the second question is yes, then obviously that's a failure. If it is going to deliver the savings, then that's a good thing, obviously. But it's more specific the technical aspects of the measure. But then for the scoring side of things, we look at the characteristics that have been implemented and what's been used to score the measure. So how many bedrooms have they selected? And we check that the suppliers check that the right number of bedrooms is selected, that the right property type is selected. So to make sure that score has been given accurately.
Great. And another question related to that was about sanction power. Do Ofgem have any sanction power?
So the only sanction power we really have is the ability to reject a measure from the scheme. So where we see that a measure hasn't met the right standards, then we can reject it from the scheme if we want to, and that impacts on the supplier because it means that they have to deliver another measure in order to meet their target instead, and then that impacts on the installer because the supplier will then withdraw the funding from that installer that's done the job. So the installer's paid to do the job and now doesn't get any reward for it. So there's a clear incentive there. Beyond that, we don't have much power, really. It's very much just the rejection of measures from the scheme. We can't go and place any more sanctions on the installer or the supplier, really, that's outside of that. Although if we see evidence of fraud, then we'll of course report all the parties to the relevant authorities. So it might be that the authorities such as the police might take action if we found evidence of fraud.
Great, thanks for clarifying. And a couple of questions related to Austrian MRV. So one was how many people work on the controls in Austria, and how did Austria overcome the GDPR data protection aspect of end users?
So I think it was also a kind of a development within the scheme. I would say in the beginning of the scheme in 2015, we had between 8 and 10 persons who were involved in the whole monitoring agency. But this also includes, for example, the audit obligation of Article 8 of the EED and other issues that are related to EED implementation. But most of it was on the supply obligation scheme. This number, however, decreased then a little bit, at least for the MRV, because first of all, there are fewer measures coming in the system, and this is, for example, due to the fact that there is still uncertainty what will be after 2020. So some companies really stop just reporting measures because they don't know what the future scheme would look like. And also due to the fact that in the beginning there was quite a huge overachievement of the obligations. So companies still profit from that. On the GDRP, I think this is if I would be, let's say, sarcastic or so, that's the nice thing about an obligation scheme, that everything is left to the obligated parties. That's the logic of it. They have the freedom how to achieve the savings, but they also have to hustle with all the things that are related to achieving these savings. But to be serious, I think one thing that helps us a lot in the GDRP thing is that our online database is embedded in the e-government portal of Austria, and this has the highest security standards that are possible. So you do all your e-government communication via this portal, and also this online reporting database is within this portal. So what we can at least guarantee is that the data that has to be submitted is safe there. And the second issue is that actually companies do not need to report and upload all the documentation completely. So they only need to give us the complete documentation if they appear in the sample. So before, there is some minimal requirement, of course, they have to upload some documentation. But for example, detailed information on household clients, for example, does not have to be uploaded in the first step, but only in a second step when it comes to an in-depth control.
Okay, great, thank you, Gregor. And we do have other questions as well, but we don't have time for all of them. So I'll just take one final one, which links to the second half of the session today. And the rest, hopefully we can answer and share with you via email after the session. So this one is about the Phoenix companies that you mentioned, Patrick. Wouldn't a metered savings approach solve this problem? Because they would only be getting paid when they deliver results as opposed to measures. Yeah, and are these types of issues considered when examining the cost effectiveness of the metered versus savings approach?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that would definitely be one solution, because I imagine the way that suppliers would fund installers is they would release funds slowly as the measure delivered the savings. So if the installer installed a measure and then disappeared, they wouldn't get paid at all. So I imagine that would work. However, there needs to be an upfront cost for the installer. So I don't think it could quite work like how I just explained, because the installer would need at least some amount of money to start off with. Otherwise, their cash flow would not be sufficient for them to be able to operate. So I think they would need an upfront cost. So I guess what we'd be aiming to do, if that was the case, would be to make sure that the upfront cost is enough for the installer to continue operating, but not enough for it to be advantageous for them to walk away. But it's a really good thought, and something that hopefully we'll be able to use in the future when monitored measures become more of a thing.
Okay, great, thanks very much, Patrick. So that brings us nicely to the second half of the session, where the focus will shift slightly to future outlooks and the possibilities that using metered savings within MRV of energy efficiency programs bring. So first up, we will have Alex Rathmell from Energy Pro, which is a UK-based consultancy, and he'll be speaking about metered savings in M&V and some learnings from UK pilots and case studies. So I will now hand over to Alex. Great, thanks, Alex. You're on mute, Alex.
Yep.
The theme of the last 6 months.
Obviously, yep. Okay, let me click this button and see if you can see my slides. How does that look?
It's blank for the moment, but it might just be taking a few seconds.
I was just thinking about it, hopefully. Apologies. Let me just, because it looks okay on mine, let me just try it again.
Yeah, it's gone blank.
Yeah, interesting. We've practiced this twice and it worked perfectly both times. And now that we're doing it for real, obviously it's not working. Let me just stop sharing and try again. Can you see anything now?
We can see the PowerPoint applications.
Oh, can you?
I mean, if you can't get into screen show mode, we can just follow in the PowerPoint mode. So if you exit full screen, it just means we can see.
Okay, maybe we'll do that. Well, apologies for that. I don't know why that suddenly decided to do that. Let me do it like this, and let's push on. Okay. Right, very good. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you all. And let me just start with some quick introductions, I suppose. So my name's Alex Rathmell. I work for a company called Energy Pro, which is a UK-based company. We're a consultancy and we're an investment business, and we work primarily in energy efficiency, but increasingly other areas of clean energy and energy flexibility as well. My background is I'm an engineer, and I should caveat this whole thing by saying that I'm not an energy efficiency policy specialist. I'm not a regulatory person or a policy person. So this presentation probably has a slightly different feel to the ones that you've seen so far today. But my background is in measurement and verification in its sort of non-residential sense. So I, for many years, ran a consultancy that provides measurement and verification services for large non-residential ESCO projects. So, you know, energy services in the public sector, for example, and large industrial users and that sort of thing. And the presentation today is about how I and we have been applying some of that thinking in the residential space in the UK in response to some market challenges, and also the opportunity to use an approach to M&V that was developed in the US that we've been looking to bring over to this side of the Atlantic. So yeah, the origin of my involvement with this is we were providing services to a company called Recurve, which is a California-based software provider, and they provide software as a service solutions for pay-for-performance programs operated by US utilities, so particularly Pacific Gas and Electric, but increasingly lots of other utilities as well. And I've got some more information on that later in the deck. But we were carrying out a market entry strategy for Recurve to look at the UK sector, to look at the UK as a potential opportunity for them, and spent some time, you know, going back about 2 years now, looking at what the opportunities might be for their technology. And it became clear that it wasn't an easy fit into the way that the UK system was set up. So in terms of the eco obligation scheme that we heard about earlier this morning, but also in, you know, other areas, the key difference between the US context in which the software is developed and the UK is the degree of deregulation of the energy sector, and I'll come back to that in a bit more detail. But suffice to say for now that we didn't find any direct applications of their software platform as you know, as part of that exercise. But I became convinced that a metered savings approach in general had real application in addressing a number of the UK's challenges, and I guess by extension, you know, could do the same in other countries as well. So I've been interested in the idea since then, and latterly we were approached by the Green Finance Institute, GFI. They're running an initiative called SEEB, which is the Coalition for Energy Efficiency in Buildings, and they're looking at ways to enable new financial products and new markets, new business models in the retrofit sector. And they asked us to lead a working group to look at metered savings, how it could be applied to the UK. So that's what we've been doing. So we're just about to publish the first output from that working group, which will be a white paper, which I need to finish, and then it'll be published hopefully sometime before Christmas. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we've got to in our thinking towards the end of this slide deck. So there we are. So that's I suppose the context. Let me just start by defining or just describing what we mean by metered savings, and more generally what I mean by M&V 2.0, which is in the title of this presentation. So, you know, I don't need to tell anybody on this call that the energy sector is changing very rapidly in, you know, everywhere in the world, and particularly the behind the meter use and shifting of energy demand is an area that's obviously receiving a great deal of focus. And the reason for starting with that observation is because I think, and I'm not the only one that thinks, that energy efficiency, by which we mean permanent reductions in energy demand, and particularly reductions in demand for heat, energy efficiency is in danger of being somewhat left behind in those conversations at a time when it has real potential to help with the decarbonisation of the wider energy system. So the chart towards the bottom of this slide shows an illustration that's a little bit old now of how the UK's demand curve could look over time, and reality is not panning out quite as dramatically as that. But the point is that, very like California, this changing energy system and the move to distributed energy resources is changing the shape of consumption, giving rise to peaks that require network capacity to support them, and that's going to be driven by electrification of heat and electrification of transport. Now, energy efficiency can be a way to reduce demand in order to increase headroom, particularly in network constrained areas. But at the moment, the energy efficiency activities that take place behind the meter, so in individual dwellings or businesses for that matter, they're not valued in any way in grid planning or operating decisions. Energy efficiency is a totally different silo, and this is certainly not unique to the UK. But I think what was interesting about the California context, where there's a vertically integrated utility that's responsible for generation, transmission, distribution, and retail of energy, they have the opportunity to steer their energy efficiency obligation programs in a way that helps with grid capacity and grid planning and management challenges in a joined up approach that's much more difficult in a deregulated market. So, for example, in California, there's this well-known problem of the duck curve, which looks a little bit like this, whereby excess PV at certain times of day poses a challenge for the grid as a whole. Actually, conventional demand reduction programs might make that problem worse by removing load from the grid at the time that you want it, because you want to be using those clean electrons. But if you can value energy savings in a granular way across the 24-hour period, so that they look much more like a distributed energy resource, then you have the opportunity to shape load by incentivizing the deployment of technologies according to the challenges that you've got, using time of day pricing, for example, and pay for performance energy efficiency obligation schemes. So we felt that was a very exciting prospect, and something that had application in the UK in future scenarios, albeit not today. So it's an area that we've been looking at ever since, as I say. So just to explain briefly, and apologies if this is already very familiar to those on the call, but this is sort of generically how the M&V 2.0 process works. And we don't need to concern ourselves too much with the details of this slide, but there is one kind of key point here, and that is that in the middle of this system is an open source calculation method for how energy savings are calculated based on a standardized set of inputs. And that's a really powerful idea, because it gives all of industry the same definition of an energy saving, and indeed gives the consumer the same definition of an energy saving. And that's transparent and open and replicable. So that's a really powerful idea, and one that we've really latched onto. But just to walk you through this, so that calculation engine, which is hosted in software, and the Recurve platform that I mentioned is one such platform. That's fed by smart meter data or advanced meter data, typically, or some equivalent to smart meter data from a different monitoring source, and information about the project or the measures that have been deployed. You might also provide information on who's deployed those measures, you know, which contractor, and other sort of contextual information. The system will collect data from, again, from open source sources about the weather, and particularly the outdoor air temperature, as being one of the key drivers of how domestic energy use will vary. And the system, certainly the Californian system, which is called CalTrack, also uses an estimate of occupancy. Now, occupancy is not measured, but it's assumed based on, or rather a proxy is used for occupancy based on day of the week and day of the year, which obviously is a major driver of different energy use behaviors. So from that, the system builds a baseline for that specific building and the energy use behavior of that specific building, based on 12 months worth or as much historic data as can be collected, that says this is the amount of energy that we would expect this building to use under a given set of circumstances. So that becomes the baseline, and that can be done on a monthly basis, it could be done on a daily basis, or it could be done increasingly on an hourly or half-hourly basis, again, to give that 24-hour profile of how savings change throughout the day. And that, we think, is going to be key to opening up future markets for energy efficiency measures to play alongside flexibility and demand response measures in future markets. And the user, so maybe that's a program operator or a utility, sees a program management dashboard or a view that says this is how the individual projects are performing, and aggregate that up to see how individual measures are performing across the board and how contractors are performing relative to one another. And in some circumstances, contractors are paid for the kilowatt hours that they've saved, pay for performance, which moves away from the kind of deemed savings model, in order to reward good quality, effective installations. Now, that is not straightforward, and actually one of the questions earlier alluded to some of the challenges around implementing that. So I'm not a purist when it comes to pay for performance by any means. There's a lot of program design that needs to go into that, but I do think it's important to start collecting real performance data on how measures and how contractors are performing, if we're to stand any chance of implementing something like pay for performance in future. But perhaps we can come back to that if we get time later on. So for me, there's two key outputs from those dashboards. So from an M&V 2.0, a metered savings platform, there's two sort of key aggregations of that data that are powerful and valuable in understanding performance. The first is a portfolio view of energy savings. So in this chart here, we're showing the percentage savings from an individual measure along the x-axis and the number of projects up the y-axis. So we're looking at a program here that's delivering average mean savings of sort of 15 to 20%, and there's a spread of performance around that mean, as you would expect, because of different contexts, different quality of installations, different building fabric conditions, all sorts of potential other variables. But the point is that we can see by measuring the savings consistently in each case, we can see how performance varies across a real population, and we can start to interrogate that and look at how it performs in homes in different regions or with different socioeconomic characteristics, etc., etc. And that's very powerful, and I would say essential if you're starting to develop new financial products for the retrofit sector that rely on householders' ability to make repayments against energy efficiency measures that have been installed, as well as we've said, for incentivizing or driving good quality projects by comparing them against a portfolio-based benchmark of performance. And of course, you've got in here, shown in red, installations where actually there's a negative saving, where energy use has gone up relative to the extended calculated baseline, and by having, I mean, which may be indicative of a problem, so we can immediately jump on those and go and investigate, or it may be indicative of a segment of the population that's not experiencing savings from this particular measure. So households that are at risk of fuel poverty, for example, might fall into that category. And again, being able to see that from the data is a real step forward, rather than relying on assumptions that are rooted in the kind of building physics models that deemed savings are derived from. And over time, energy efficiency programs and projects can be targeted according to where we expect performance to be best based on this sort of view. And the other view that's important, which you can achieve if you are able to measure at half-hourly or hourly granularity, is what's known as a resource curve, which tracks the aggregate energy savings or energy use avoidance across the 24-hour period, aggregated across a number of homes, either in a geographical region or in whatever arbitrary categorization you would want to apply. And essentially what that's doing is treating energy efficiency as a procurable distributed energy resource that could be integrated alongside dispatchable resources and flexible resources, albeit that it's not in itself a controllable resource. It can and does have a role in shaping demand and shaping the load, and that will be increasingly the case as heating, space heating, water heating is electrified, giving more control over the timing of when that heating takes place. So that's a really powerful view as well. I won't go into this one, but there's a great deal of activity around this in the US. There are some European Commission funded Horizon 2020 projects looking at this whole area as well. So there's this is not something that's that we're kind of saying for the first time by any means. But what I wanted to do is just touch on how we'd got on in the UK so far, really as an illustration of how the discussion might go in other member states as well. So rightly or wrongly, we approached the UK market in two ways. We considered that broadly there are two opportunities for this sort of approach. One is under energy efficiency programs such as ECO, or future programs, I suppose, and the other is in the growing area of flexibility markets for distributed resources that solve network problems in particular areas. So as network operators transition to being system operators, there are various competitions and tenders being run in different parts of the country, and our view is that energy efficiency should be able to participate in those. So those are the two areas that we looked at. Now with the eco idea, as was mentioned earlier on, there is, I think, strong interest in transitioning eco to more of a measured savings basis over time, which allowed us to have some discussions with obligated suppliers about how that might look. I think it's fair to say that the obligated suppliers view this as being quite a risky transition away from the way that things have been done so far, based on a deemed approach. So we weren't really able to get much traction there in the absence of a kind of stronger policy signal, I suppose, around the direction that was moving in. But there is certainly a great deal of interest in the benefits that could bring, and those benefits are in areas around performance of contractors, the effectiveness of the measures, obviously, that are installed, and issues around consumer trust and confidence in the measures that are being installed. And those are issues that have been recurring for the UK retrofit sector for many years. we're very wary of saying that metered savings is a silver bullet that moves us away from all of that. But we do think that that empirical measurement of performance has got a role to play in overcoming those trust and kind of quality concerns. On the flexible energy systems side, there are moves afoot to allow permanent demand reductions to participate in those auctions. The big problem at the moment is that the value that's available via that route is very small and doesn't make much difference to the economics of an energy efficiency project or program. So again, we struggled at that stage to get traction in that space, other than on a kind of desktop evaluation and testing model. So we were able to do some testing with BEIS, which is the government department, UK government department that's responsible for these areas, and we simulated how a metered savings approach could work based on a data set that BEIS maintained called NEED, National Energy Efficiency Database, I think. So we were able to make some progress there, but essentially there are much wider transitions, bigger transitions that need to take place in order for this to have more widespread application. But just to finish this bit, I think the goal needs to be to have a unified system for measuring energy savings, irrespective of which program or which is the driver for those savings taking place. So if we can arrive at a definition of energy savings that is similar to the Caltrac protocol in California, then the prize is having every retrofit project, regardless of which program it's in or which tenure it's in or who's delivered it, having them all measured the same way. At that point, we start to value energy efficiency as an energy resource in its own right. So sort of irrespective of how many steps it takes to get there, I think that's the end goal that we've got in mind. So just to bring you up to date on the Green Finance Institute initiative. As I mentioned at the beginning, Green Finance Institute have been running an initiative on energy efficiency for most of this year called SEEB, and they asked us to look after the working group that's looking at metered energy savings. So we've been very pleased by the amount of interest that's had from across the retrofit industry, but also from the financial sector, because it's seen as a way to provide financiers with data that they've never had before. And so we've set ourselves two objectives for this group. One is to identify pilot projects in which we can test an approach to metered savings that's right for the UK context. And secondly, to define a draft protocol, so analogous to Caltrac, but not the same as Caltrac, recognizing that the UK context is quite different, based on some of the factors that I've already described. So we've held all of those working group sessions now, and we're in the process of writing it up. I've just included this schematic just for illustrative purposes. I'm not going to go through it, but essentially the feeling from the working group was that what's needed is, as I say, a unified system that can be deployed with every retrofit, which means that it has to be something that can be used by retrofit professionals working for individual householders, to deliver a commercial solution. So it needs to be low cost enough to deliver at that level, but also easy enough to deliver at that level. Now in the UK, there is a standard called PAS 2035, which is an end-to-end standard for the whole retrofit journey, which has been developed and introduced in response to some of those quality concerns that have kind of dogged the industry for a number of years. And the retrofit evaluation stage of that process is something that needs to be filled with tools that enable easy and effective evaluation. So really, when we've been developing this protocol with the working group, we've got our eye on that future application so that a retrofit professional can use the protocol at the end of a retrofit journey to evidence to the client and any other stakeholders what the performance has been. So the other kind of main points that came out of that consultation were the need for granular and near real-time data. So half-hourly data was seen as being the optimal level in order to be able to demonstrate load shaping benefits, as I said. A clear process for data collection, bearing in mind that access to smart meter data is something that's quite poorly understood and in some senses quite challenging because of confidentiality, GDPR constraints, and also the way that the data is held. So clear instructions on how to obtain the right data. And of course, many households don't yet have a smart meter. So what to do in households where that's the case. The need to collect data that informs that extended baseline calculation. So some proxy for occupancy, and crucially, data about the weather and the outdoor air temperature conditions. Another point that came through really strongly was that the marginal carbon abatement effects of energy saving measures needed to be explicitly calculated by this protocol, in order that, for example, the effect of rooftop PV on an individual carbon performance of a project can be accurately taken into account, because the prize there is enabling future products that use that to time the use of energy according to lowest carbon signals. So that carbon calculation was a really strong bit of feedback. And finally, it was felt that absolutely vital in the UK context, where housing stock performance is quite poor, to explicitly measure indoor environment quality parameters. And that's something that's not done in the US California context, where the focus is on the grid benefits. But because this issue is something that recurs and is a real problem being confronted by the retrofit industry, it was felt essential to measure indoor air temperature, relative humidity and CO2 concentration within the home, and to provide those as outputs from the overall evaluation that the metered savings was providing. In turn, that will allow the calculation to be fed by an occupancy estimate that's derived from some of those measures. So it actually has a dual benefit. But I think the primary driver for that decision is about making sure that the retrofit has delivered an indoor environment that is good quality and fit for purpose, and it hasn't delivered an indoor environment that either hasn't improved or still leaves the householder with damp or underheating conditions, having done the job. So that was felt to be a really important attribute of the future protocol. So what we're hoping to do is to we've applied for some funding with GFI and with an organisation called the Energy Systems Catapult, which is a market accelerator. We've applied for some funding to develop this approach to a minimum viable product stage, not on a commercial basis. This is all on an open source basis with a view to enabling future markets. And we have integrated it into a forthcoming retrofit program in Wales. So we're hoping to collect real data from that program in order to build and then test and calibrate the model that we've developed. And we'll also, as I say, be publishing the white paper, which contains the detail behind this schematic over the next few weeks, which we'll put out. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say really. But I think this is a really exciting area that's enabled now by new technologies that presents a huge opportunity for energy saving programs to move away from deemed savings and into empirical measurement. And the prize, as we're hearing from the Green Finance Institute, is potentially huge if we start collecting this real performance data in terms of what we could enable for solutions and finance products going forward. So yeah, look forward to any questions you might have. You can find me on by email if needed, and there's some links to the various initiatives that I've mentioned. But yeah, look forward to answering any questions in the chat later on. And thanks again for the chance to speak to you all.
Great, Alex, thank you very much for that. Yeah, lots of food for thought there, and yeah, on the future of all of this. So for our final speaker of the day, and then we'll have an opportunity to come back to you, Alex, for questions, we have Dario De Santo from FIRA, Italy. FIRA is a not-for-profit organisation promoting the sustainable use of energy, and Dario will share with us his experience of using metered savings in the white certificate scheme. So Dario, I will give you presenter rights, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Adriana. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to have a possibility to share some insight on the white certificate scheme with respect to metered savings. As you will see, it is something different with respect to the previous presentation, because in that case, we can use the general meters, provided we have smart meters, of course, whereas in the Italian scheme, we deal with specific meters installed in order to determine the effective savings related to a particular energy efficiency measure. Just 2 words about our scheme. It's an energy efficiency obligation. The obliged parties are electricity and gas distributors with more than 50,000 clients. And we have a lot of eligible parties, which are the other distributors, ESCOs, and all the end users, which have either an energy management expert who has to be certified according to an Italian standard, or an energy management system certified according to ISO 50001 standard. So our scheme is also a tradable market, which works both as a spot market and as an over-the-counter market. And white certificate can thus work as an incentive for the voluntary parties that can implement energy efficiency actions, get the certificates, and sell them to the obliged parties. Another important point is that white certificates are recognized and given for a certain number of years, which varies from 3 years, which is good for behavioral change, to 10 years for the more complex projects. And 1 white certificate corresponds to 1 ton of oil equivalent of primary savings. The results of the scheme over the 15 years in which it has worked are 54 million of certificates issued over the years, that corresponds to around 28 million ton of oil equivalent accumulated, delivered by the end of 2019. Around 61% of these savings are metered, and there's been the capability to really promote manufacturing process improvements in the industrial sectors, and on not only cross-sectoral measures. This scheme has got a very low cost of incentive if compared with other national schemes, like, for example, a tax credit. It's the longer scheme which has been working in Italy, and it has given us a lot of information over the years. In terms of assessing the savings, in the beginning we used 3 different approaches. One was demat savings, that has been the main one in the first years. The second one was something like engineering estimates, and the third one has been metered saving that we call monitoring plan projects. Of course, demat savings are the easiest ones. They are good to start, and maybe we are always good, at least in part. But our experiences teaches us that meter savings are a viable option and an interesting one. Of course, the main issue is to measure the savings. So we need to calculate the ex-ante baseline consumption. We need to meter also the ex-post consumption, and we need to meter also the normalization factors like weather, occupancy, the production of a single product line and a manufacturing process, for example, and so on. So basically, in order to use this approach, we need usually 1 year of measurements of the energy consumption to define the baseline. And since 2017, hourly meters are required to do this. When we need to adjust this baseline according to the adjustment factors, which makes sense considering the particular energy efficiency measure. In case of new installation, of course, we won't have this baseline, and so we have to evaluate a reference market baseline, but of course, this is a different topic. And of course, we need to measure the ex-post consumption with dedicated meters. This activity, of course, is done on a per project basis, and the difference between this approach and the one of the previous presentation is that we can't rely on general meters, but we have to use dedicated meters. Unless, of course, the amount of savings generated by the measure is more or less in line with the total consumption, or better, it is linkable to the total consumption of the facility. This can be the case, of course, of deep renovation of buildings, which, by the way, are not usually considered for this scheme, but it is not usually the option for the typical interventions that fall under this scheme in Italy. In practice, the applicants has to present a proposal in which they have to describe the project, including the ex-ante situation, the expected modification. There should be the definition of the measurement and verification program, so the variables which are metered, the meters used to do that, the algorithm used to assess the savings, the adjustment factors, and so on. Based on that, also the data about the ex-ante energy consumption are provided, usually for 1 year, even if it is possible to shorten this period of time, but the proponent have to demonstrate that the data remains reliable. And of course, there are information, documentation on the startup date of the project and on the general information that allows the evaluators to address the type of project, to understand effectively how it works, and so on. After this proposal is accepted, then the proponent, year by year, has to present a request for certification, providing the data for the ex-post measurement, both for the energy consumption and, of course, the normalization factors. What are the main differences between this approach and the demon saving file? Of course, it is more complex. So this is the main barrier that usually hampers its use across managing agencies. This is true, but on the other hand, it is also true that when you deal with large projects or medium-sized projects like the ones that you usually find in the industrial sector, but also in the commercial one, at least when you consider large companies, it makes sense. The costs are in line with what you can expect for an MMV procedure in these cases. And then you can consider a lot of advantages that this kind of procedure brings. The first one, of course, is that you measure the effective savings. The second one is that you stimulate the proponents to achieve high performances, because you get the more certificates, the more the performance is, and so of course the incentive is higher. Theoretically, the documentation is a little bit substantial and larger than in case of demon saving files, but after all the frauds we had in the last years, this has proven not to be the case in many projects. So practically, in order to contrast frauds, which are a typical problem of demon saving projects, you need to require a lot of documentation. And so at the end, there is no such difference between demon savings projects and monitoring projects. Of course, you have data about the metering, that is an addition in case of monitoring plan projects, but it's worth to have. This approach requires a little bit more effort for the evaluator, and that's because there are a lot of different type of projects that can be presented. Many times that can be really complex, especially in the industrial sector, and that requires a lot of competences for the evaluators. But apart from that, the effort required in terms of time is not very much longer than the one required for demon saving projects. By the way, also linking with what has been said in the first two presentations today, in our country we discovered that in addition to controls on the documentation for demon saving projects, it is very important to also check proponents. And this is the case especially when you deal with the possibility to sum up different interventions in one single project, because in Italy we had the issue of evil purpose companies created just to present the false projects, false documentation. And in that case, by checking the documents, you won't be able easily to discover frauds. Whereas sometimes it is better to check when it has been created, the company, how many employees it has, and a lot of parameters that can say a lot in terms of the reliability of such company. Of course, there are complexities to be dealt with, and so it is very important that the managing agency, that in Italy is the GSE, support the proponents in understanding the procedures and in presenting a project. And for example, there are guidelines assessing the topic of how to deal with baseline when you don't have 1 year of measurements, and so how to use statistics, for example, to cover the data you don't have. There are guidelines giving a lot of information differentiated by sector and type of energy efficiency measures, and so on. And this is very important, and unfortunately, this type of guidelines have been produced only in the last years and not since the beginning. Some lessons learned to conclude with. First of all, the idea of using measurement and verification approach based on or inspired by IPMVP option B or similar can be complicated, especially in the beginning, but once the proponents have understood that it is feasible and it is manageable, at least for medium and large projects. That is, for the industrial sector, it makes a lot of sense. High quality MMV improves project quality, qualifies operators that learns a lot by dealing with this kind of projects and provide a lot of valuable data to managing authorities, which are very useful when you have to modify the measures, but also when you have to deal, for example, with the actual plan for energy efficiency in your country. And third, meter saving stimulates, of course, proponents to achieve high performance, and the idea is like the pay for performance we have listed before. When we have the high quality MMV needs support in terms of information and also training, and this has to be provided by the managing authority. It is very important both to shorten the time needed by applicants to be able to use this kind of procedures and to reduce the risk of non-conformities or errors, meaning that also the evaluators have to do a simpler work afterwards. Flexibility should be granted with a lesson learned, even if presently is not applied, and so it is better not to exaggerate with requirements for meters and with ex-ante baseline, because of course one of the barriers of this kind of approach with respect to the demand saving approach is that you need 1 year of measurement, whereas in the other case you just implement the measure and you present it, and this is of course a complexity that has to be dealt with. And also another problem can be that when you have a tradable market like in Italy, dealing only with meter savings, like is the case in our country since 2017, is not a good idea. Because, for example, if you have a short market, like we had in the last 3 years, the signal price you get from the market, so price going up and saying, okay, it's very interesting to present new white certificate projects, produces effects after 1.5 years, 2 years, because first you have to measure the baseline, then to present the proposal and to have it accepted, and then you can start with metering. And so this is, if you have only meter saving in place, that can be an issue, unless you are able to remain in equilibrium in the market. So you don't have this kind of issue with a short market. Last point, okay, as Gregor said, to find out the right mix between strictness and business is the real challenge that managing authorities and policymakers have. You need to adopt a try and error approach, basically to understand which is the most suitable measure in your case. But I think that Italian experience shows that meter savings, even with this type of approach, so detailed and based on a per project basis, can be used and are a good opportunity, a good option, especially when you deal with medium and large energy efficiency actions. So that's it, and of course I'm available for questions